Hello and welcome to my very first video. My name is Emily Fraser Rath. Thank you for joining me. This is a video that will start a series, which is a little bit by way of context and conversation and questions about the book by R.F. Kuang called Babel, or The Necessity of Violence in Arcane History. I am a former German studies professor, which you would think has very little to do with this book. There's only one German character, and we'll get to him later and his significance. And of course, the German language pops up throughout the book. We're talking about an institution for translation, and there are lots of languages that are mentioned, which will be a big thing that we'll talk about later. But other than that, that's really where the German references end. But I'd like to sort of contest this narrow notion of what a German studies professor can do and is. I like to think of myself much more broadly as a humanities professor or a formal one, but someone trained in the humanities. And my expertise really lies in cultural and literary criticism. My research and my praxis focus is actually very tied to many of the themes that we'll talk about that are related to this book. Things like decolonization, social movements, and transnational adoption. This is my way of making a humanities-based conversation and line of inquiry similar to what you would find in a college or university classroom, much more accessible and available to the general public. The humanities, which is the study of how humans have and continue to think and create, gives us a really interesting framework that helps us to focus on the ways that discourse and texts are constructed, the way that cultural products enter and shape our individual and collective consciousness, the roles they play, how they've been created, why they've been created in that way, how they've been constructed, and then how we can deconstruct them to find their moving parts. These entry points give us an opportunity to think critically about what's going on in the world and what has gone on in the world, and most specifically, how we talk about and represent what's going on in the world, what's going on in us, what's going on in our relationships, and what's going on according to our human standpoint, thus the humanities. Okay, Babel. Book one. But actually, we're not even going to get to the book one. We're talking about the author's note today. We're not going to get beyond that because there's so much going on there. However, if you haven't read book one yet, please do so before watching this video because there are some things that could be spoilers. All right, let's go. This book begins not with a narrative, but as I mentioned, a short author's note. It's entitled The Author's Note on Her Representations of Historical England and the University of Oxford in particular. Whenever we consider a book, we look at the cover, we look at the back cover, the various blurbs, what the date of the text is, the languages in which it was translated, the language in which it was originally written, who the translator was, the place of publication, the publisher. In this case, we have an author's note at the beginning sometimes, and also a dedication earlier on. But we also have in some books a prologue or an addition to an edition that comes at a later point, maybe a decade after the first publication of the book, and can be written by the author or it can be written by someone else. So we know right away that Rebecca Kuang studied at Oxford. And that of what is in the book is her own experience, her memories, her feelings, her thoughts about the place. It's informed by these things. Just she went in the 2000s and not in the 1830s. She tells us straight away that while there's a lot in the book that remains, quote, true to reality, she's changed many other things. We might then think of the world that's represented in this book, parallel one to our own, but just one that's been sort of slightly distorted, or one that includes some magical elements, as we'll get to. So you should never skip anything that precedes the actual narrative of a book. The author's note, for example, here is there because she wants us to read it, and she wants us to do so before we delve into the story. So there's a reason for it. Just as there's a reason of including that map of Oxford and the picture depicting the fictionalized Tower of Babel, she wants us to pay attention to these elements. She's added to reality because they have significance and will impact the way we experience the novel. So it's interesting then that a fictional novel, we might call it historical fiction. It's also been categorized as in the dark academia genre, the magical realism genre, the fantasy genre, and we'll get to why and how it's categorized, what that means further on. I think it's interesting, though, that she pulls our attention into the ways she's distorted reality. She draws our attention into those elements right up front. Not all historical fiction does this, as you may know. If we're also going to call this book fantasy, a lot of fantasy is not based in reality at all. So think of Fourth Wing or Harry Potter, though there are, of course, instances of that. So you do have fantasy like Kindred and Beloved by Toni Morrison, the self-proclaimed anti-J.K. Rowling, lovely series, The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. This relationship between the real and the made up, or the fictional and the fantasy, is important. She tells us it's important by focusing our attention on it even before we start the novel. She's worked the local geography a bit too, so that the Royal Institute of Translation fits snugly into the middle of campus, towering literally over the rest of the institution. She's changed a bit about the actual order of things. The timeline of history has little tweaks to it. For example, the finishing of the Oxford to Paddington railway line takes place earlier in the novel than it did in reality. Many of these peculiarities, as she calls them in this author's note, are quite small and have a little more to do than with fitting certain events and spaces into this, quote, altered history of the novel. We are called to pay attention to this alteredness of this history, however, the ways in which things actually were and the ways in which things are presented in the novel align, but in ways that don't quite get to the reality. We must hold these contradictions of reality versus representation of reality, the uncanny reality, maybe. We must hold these contradictions and tensions in our mind as we go on. And this is a main theme of the novel. Timeline of the text. Kuang writes, quote, "The Oxford Martyrs Monument does exist, this is it, but was not completed until 1843, 3 years after the conclusion of the novel." So right here, we have now the end date of the novel, which is 1840. We know from the first page of book 1 that Robin is dying from cholera when Professor Lovell finds him. We know that Robin is made to leave Canton in 1828 because we've read the back cover of the book where it says it. So we know that the book takes place between 1828 and 1840 amidst this wave of the Asiatic cholera outbreaks. And this gives us the historical backdrop for the book. The span of the novel is 1828 to 1840. And we know in reality that in Canton, missionaries and government agents, scholars and merchants were actively trying to open up what was known as the Canton trade system in order to gain more control over the trading of goods like porcelain and tea with the Chinese, but also really open up more broadly trading opportunities in the Eastern world. The Chinese government during this time, the Qing dynasty, dictated the conditions under which trade with foreign nationals could be conducted. And they were very strict about what this trade would look like. 3 cities, Macau, Canton and Hong Kong were the centers of this hyper-regulated trading system. From 1557 and until 1999, the Portuguese controlled Macau, which you'll see here. So other Western powers, like the British, moved upriver to cities like Canton, which we call Guangzhou now, to try to gain a stronghold there. Though there are several reasons why the Europeans were able to take over these cities, historian Peter Perdue cites two things. One, the introduction, and it was a strategic introduction of opium to these port cities, as well as the technological advances in the British Navy and sea travel, including the invention of steam-powered merchant and warships that really precipitated this change. He writes, quote, "The collapse of the Canton system was marked by the Opium War of 1839 to 1842, in which the British defeated the Chinese under the banner of free trade and forced them to legalize opium imports, open new ports to trade, and agreed to a low fixed tariff." End quote. We will read about the effects of opium on the population of Canton later on in the book, but suffice it to say for now that the first opium war between the Chinese and instigated by the British is what is looming at the end of the novel. The end of Chinese autonomy when it comes to trade and the continuation of European colonization in parts of China and the expansion of this colonization are the stakes. What could be lost. In 1841, in reality, the British formally colonized Hong Kong, and to end the war, the governments of China and Britain established an open trade agreement, and the province of Canton, again known as Guangzhou, through the Treaty of Nanjing. What we are about to read is a fictionalized account of what happened in reality in the 1830s, and a fictionalized rendering of the conditions that ultimately led to the British seizing parts of China and forcing the Chinese into a so-called free trade agreement. I think the significance of this will unravel as we read the rest of the novel, but I like to keep in mind a few things. First of all, why write a novel that parallels real historical events, but uncannily so? In other words, what is there to be gained by revisiting the past, but shifting things just so that we are reminded that what we are reading is fiction, even as we're forced into proximity with reality? What does it mean to write a story adjacent to the real past in the 2020s? And what does it mean to be reading it now, whenever now is for you? This time in history has a lot of implications, not only for the Chinese, which you see here in this political cartoon, Uncle Sam standing in the middle, Germany and Italy and England and Russia and France, with Franz Josef, the Zweite, in the background, are cutting up China. Ultimately, this is where the sphere of influence of many European powers occurred in the Chinese Empire during the early 1900s and late 1800s. The British, the French, the Japanese, Russian, and Germans taking over parts of the country and controlling them. This is similar to what happened during the Berlin Conference in 1885. This, shockingly, was a conference that took place in Berlin amongst many of the same powers that were at the table when dividing up China. So we can see the effects of that in this map. In 1880, this was prior to the Berlin Conference, this is what the continent of Africa looked like, belonging to local indigenous folks primarily, though 10% of the continent was already colonized by this time. Algeria was occupied by the French, and Cape Colony, later obviously South Africa, held by the British. But in the years after the Berlin Conference, by 1913, 90% of the continent was formally colonized, primarily, again, by European powers. The United Kingdom, France, Portugal, Spain, Italy, Germany, and Belgium, to name a few. And so this is what is at stake at the end of this novel. I'll leave us with one more thing to consider. At the beginning of my edition of the book, and perhaps yours too, is a list of praise for Babel. The very first one, from the New York Times Book Review, reads, Babel derives its power from sustaining a contradiction, from trying to hold in your head both love and hatred for the charming thing that sustains itself by devouring you. We talked a bit about the contradictions that need sustaining as we read this book, and we'll return to this idea as well. But I have a problem with this review because I don't think it quite gets to the power of this text. The thing that the characters both love and hate in the book and in this quote, and the thing that is devouring them, is academia, the academy, the ivory tower, or the Tower of Babel. It's also all of these things as they are tied to the imperialist project. But personally, I think the power of the book is not in its ability to sustain this contradiction, though certainly that is quite a feat, but to also to break it and to tell us the harm that occurs when we live with and accept these contradictions. What do these contradictions, this trying to live in a world that we don't necessarily agree with and we see as exploitative? Certainly, those of us who critique capitalism can feel this contradiction. What does this do to us? But we'll get there.